Featuring what I personally feel is the strongest scare of 2025 so far, this horror film from the director of Barbarian may just go on to be the scariest thing released all year. In January of 2023, New Line Cinema secured the rights to produce a script written by Cregger, director of the 2022 critical success, Barbarian. This was a script described as a horror epic, apparently labelled as a personal story for Cregger. It was one that had garnered a lot of pre-production hype on concept alone, proven by the fact that Jordan Peele had gone as far as to part ways with his longtime managers after losing the script at auction. Weapons is a story that begins on a random night at 2:17 AM. Well, that was a bit fucking scary. Telling the story of a small town in Pennsylvania as 17 children from the same classroom all simultaneously rose from their beds and ran from their homes into the darkness. Almost as soon as the credits started rolling on Weapons, I was certain that I was going to cover it in some capacity. To what degree remained to be seen at the time. I didn't know whether I was going to wait for a digital release so I'd have more footage, or if I'd try and work my magic to get my thoughts out quicker. And judging on when you're seeing this, you know which one I went with. Also, spoilers, if you have any intention of seeing Weapons and have yet to do so, then maybe now isn't the best time to watch this thing. If it were my choice, I'd have you go and watch another one of my videos, but until you've seen the film, if you want to avoid spoilers, maybe hold off on this. The opening premise that Weapons supplies us with is one that was plastered all over the marketing. As early as our first look at the idea, we knew the central mystery to the narrative. We knew the rough track this story would follow. When Justine Gandy enters her classroom to find that all but one of the children have failed to turn up, what follows is a representation of mob mentality, portrayed in a quality that's leagues ahead of 2021's Halloween Kills. One of the many things that Weapons handles with a better care is the many stages of grief found in a state of no resolution. Cregger has stated that following the death of a close friend in 2021, writing the screenplay for this film became something of a way to interact with those intense feelings without ever becoming overtly self-destructive. He hasn't delved into exactly how he was able to channel that grief into the 2-hour horror experience, but it's clear when watching that the concept is rife in the context. Each of these characters could be channeled to the many ways that we tackle grief. There are already several analytical approaches to dissecting this film, and I think this is one of those that definitely has a lot more weight. There are also several think pieces and video essays online that do it much better justice than I could. Looking at how Justine represents suppression, Archer represents conflict resolution, and James being the epitome of addiction. Weapons could be perceived as a standard horror movie, but I do think there's a reward in taking the time to dive deeper into the narrative elements that pack a bit more of a bite than initially seen. One angle I've seen be used in the criticism against the film is the disjointed or sometimes misaligned plot structure. Weapons looks to play around with perspective, often folding back in on itself when stories intersect. I could see why this creates a little bit of an issue for some people, but me personally, I couldn't disagree more. The thing is, as much as we want to debate whether or not Weapons would benefit from being chronologically structured, what's not up for debate is the importance of the structure in creating the desired effect that the film ultimately gains. There's no distinct order to grief, no sense of control, with catharsis often coming in odd and unlikely manners, if at all. Without that aspect, a fundamental element of the movie could be missing, and it would all lose part of itself as a result. The horror of the event seeps into the fabric of an entire community. Maybrook is a small, self-contained place where most people know each other in some way. That then comes with the fact that everyone has someone to suspect when something goes wrong. Without any valid answer to the ongoing mystery, the town turns inward and begins to chew on that slow-burning paranoia. This leads to the implosion of Justine's life. Not only is she grappling with the grief herself, but with the weaponized grief of the town being projected onto her. The way that Cregger frames all of this is equally important. The story is split between these characters, with each of them being given their own thread of this mystery. It's a simple narrative framework, but it goes to show that none of us are ever seeing the full picture. The events of Weapons are pieced together from fragments and half-understood nightmares. And in those moments where the intensity flares, the film still knows the value of silence. Long, unwinding sequences hang heavy in the air, making every minuscule sound seem invasive to the human ear. The dread is built on the knowledge that something is happening, despite the somewhat disappointing take that nothing is. Yes, like always, films are going to be subjective to criticisms of various quality, and Weapons is definitely no exception to that. One thing I've seen that's really concerned me honestly is the feedback that nothing seems to happen in the movie, as if it has a start, a middle and an end with no plot to carry it. Personally, to be blunt, I think this is really shallow. I do also believe that even on the surface, what this film is trying to say is painfully clear at times, but I won't use that against people as I know that we all do engage with media at different paces. I get that horror is an incredibly subjective medium, perhaps the most subjective of all, and Weapons does itself no favours by mixing in comedy, which is arguably second place. With the third act aside, it's sparingly used, and some of the audiences have felt that it does take away from that experience. And while I do disagree with that sentiment, I can at least understand that. The trailer for this movie gives off a tone that is almost jarringly different to the final product at times, and I know that could create a bit of a disconnect for people watching it. It never once took me out of things leading into the final scenes, but it wouldn't surprise me if the disappointment from some stemmed from the different tone. My problem isn't with any of that criticism, I get it. I don't feel it, but I get it. To circle back on it, my whole problem with the critiques aimed at this film is the nothing happens debate, because it's just so overwhelmingly misconstrued. It strikes me as honestly a little concerning that people have gone to see a movie with that title and that premise, following the disappearance of 17 school children and the collective unanswered grief response from the parents, using several different characters throughout the narrative to portray that, and then walk out thinking that they've seen 2 hours of nothing. There's something in the way that Weapons treats the concept of the safe space. Whether that be home, a classroom, or anything to that degree. The corruption and invasion of evil is a prevalent concept that's explored through various means in Aunt Gladys. This is personified through various means. A nightmare from both Justine and Archer's perspectives, showing that their paths may be more aligned than we were initially meant to believe, and a brutal, upsetting scene involving Marcus and his husband. In what I can describe as the film's most cruel sequence, Gladys performs a ritual that sees Marcus put under her control, weaponized if you will, and made to murder his husband through an incredibly disturbing assault. However, this isn't to say that all of the film's scares feature brutality in some way. In fact, one of the scariest sequences in the entire movie comes in the dead of night, bathed in an eerie quiet. I don't want to come across as preachy or overconfident when I say this, but I truly believe that Weapons features a scare so intense despite doing so little that it may be one of my favourites ever. As Justine Gandy camps in her car outside the home of the only surviving child, Alex, she falls asleep, and what we are made to witness is nothing short of terrifying. As she sleeps, we're left watching the front door of the house as it opens, at first finding that nothing walks from the darkness for a good few moments. Then, as this haunting music builds up into a sudden pulsating dread, a woman wanders out in a strange, jarring way. The best way I can describe it is as though she's on strings, with each limb being puppeted by a force beyond our comprehension, a fact that, at this point in the film, is all too accurate. This entire sequence made me sick to my stomach. It was a fleeting feeling that I was deeply unsettled and uneasy with what I was witnessing. A feeling so severe that I haven't really felt in any capacity since last year's Longlegs, which has seen the occasional comparison to this. That for me was the predominant feeling throughout Weapons. A prolonged feeling of deeply unsettling unease. It represents terror in a way that has moved me, and it personifies fear in a way that reminds me of the value I hold in horror and the love that I have for the genre. I admittedly had problems with Cregger's previous film, more so in the tonal shift around halfway through, and I feel that Weapons does everything in its power to rectify that. The catharsis it brings isn't a tidy resolution. It's the kind you can't quite shake because it feels both distant and uncomfortably close. Beneath those unsettling visuals and deliberately fractured structure is a film that becomes a mirror for our tragic inability to truly process grief. Weapons may not be the movie that the trailers had led me in to believe I was seeing, but I think what we ultimately got led to a better experience. We can sit here and debate whether the concept of an unresolved narrative would result in a tragic and, ironically, more fulfilling experience, but at this stage, like I've said, I enjoy the ending. I do believe it offers a very bleak and depressing outlook with the whole, things could get better idea, even though we, the audience, as well as the characters know, that's probably not the case.